My husband gave his mistress my front row church pew, so I quietly liquidated our joint trust. My name is Ruby Thompson, and I am 57 years old. Before I share how they lost everything because of their own entitlement, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe it's time for us to stop carrying everyone else and start protecting our peace. For 30 years, I ironed shirts for Sunday, cooked pot roast for fellowship dinners, and signed papers that kept Marcus preaching. I thought my loyalty was strength until the morning I watched somebody else sit in my place. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to the day I opened my first salon on Maryland Avenue. When the rent was 2 months past due, the landlord called me. I was 5 months pregnant with our second child, and Marcus had a sermon to write. I remember that sticky heat of August and the way I balanced the salon ledger on one knee while wiping hair dye off a little boy's ears with the other hand. I signed a loan for Marcus's ministry, co-signed because he was new, and because the deacons were watching and I didn't want his hands tied when God moved. The bank teller said, "Congratulations, Mrs. Thompson," like I had just stepped into a church pew of my own. I believed every sacrifice was a blessing. Before church on Sundays, I'd set out extra plates. Candied yams, collard greens, macaroni with a crusty top that only my Aunt Lillian could rival. People sat at our table and left with their pockets heavy with advice and prayers. They left mine lighter with the bills Marcus never mentioned. I kept petty cash in a shoebox under my kitchen sink, cash for the choir robe repairs, cash for the youth trip, cash for when the van wouldn't start on a rainy Tuesday. Marcus would kiss my forehead and say, "You'll be rewarded in heaven." I started counting God's promises the way I counted change, because that's what a pastor's wife does. The salon became a second sanctuary. Women came for hair and left with stories. I always lent, never refused. I co-signed a line of credit to cover building the fellowship hall because Marcus said it would bring more people to the church. He told me about plans late at night when the house was silent, an enlarged kitchen, a new nursery, a place where the community could eat together. I wrote checks from the boutique account, drove to the bank, signed the mortgage documents, and convinced myself I was stewarding faith. The numbers blurred after a decade. When the IRS sent a notice about payroll, Marcus set it aside and said, "Ruby, that's for Mrs. Jenkins to handle." I handled it because I always had. Our children grew up with my voice in the background of their accomplishments. "Go on, baby, we'll figure it out." While Marcus wrote sermons about sacrifice that conveniently omitted the name of their mother. There were nights I woke with my hands clenched around a mug of coffee, unopened bills on the kitchen table, and the television playing church service footage. I learned to fold my hurt into casseroles and hand it out at potlucks. At potlucks, I smiled for pictures, for newsletters, and sometimes for donors who wanted to see the pastor's happy home. The Sunday smiles were the most dangerous. Always photographs, always proof that we were whole. When my mother died, Marcus preached her funeral with a tenderness that made my knees weak. He placed a small framed photo of her on the choir loft and announced plans to name a memorial fund. I trusted him to steward her legacy. I left the reading room thinking of probate and unpaid invoices, and I wrote a check to the memorial fund because it felt right. The fund became another ledger line I didn't monitor. Loving him, serving him, supporting the ministry, these became indistinguishable. I told myself I was keeping the family intact. I told myself I was the backbone. The truth was, I was supporting a family built more on appearances than accountability. One winter evening, when the heater broke at the church and the youth group shivered through rehearsal, I wired money from my boutique savings to fix it. Marcus hugged me in front of the pulpit like I'd climbed a mountain for the congregation, and I stood there relieved and exhausted. No one asked where the money came from. No one ever asked. That quiet acceptance formed the thickest chain around my ribs. The more I gave, the more invisible the giving became. I'd learned to measure love by what I could provide, until one Sunday morning, the measurement failed me. The betrayal didn't start with the pew. It started with whispers, laughter behind hands, a younger woman's name passing like a new hymn. People assumed clergy marriages were complicated, that ministers were tempted, that first ladies had duty calls tougher than the average Sunday. I let it wash over me while running scissors along a client's nape. When Tiffany began to sit closer and laugh louder during fellowship, my stomach dropped like someone had turned off the lights. She was new to the community, a smiling college instructor with polished nails and stories about retreats. Marcus introduced her one Wednesday night as a friend. He placed her on the second row beside the choir, and I told myself I was overreacting. The Sunday it happened, everything in me recited restraint. Marcus walked Tiffany into the sanctuary with the confidence of a man displaying a new sermon illustration. He guided her past the pew where my mother used to sit, past the small stool where I left my Bible, and he murmured to the usher, "Make sure she has the front seat tonight." The usher looked to me, uncertain. I felt the hush of the hymn drop away. I did not stand, did not make a scene. I folded my hands like Scripture itself had instructed me to be silent. After service, Marcus laughed with the choir director as if nothing had shifted. Tiffany accepted compliments about her dress, and people brought her casseroles like they'd known her a lifetime. I carried the coffee urns to the kitchen with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Later, when we were alone, I said, "Marcus, why did you—" He cut me off with a hand so casual it could have been a sermon gesture. "Ruby, that's between Tiffany and me. You making a public spectacle about it won't help." His voice had the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed this exact dismissal. He told me to pray. He told me not to listen to gossip. He told me I was making it about me. Tiffany began appearing at home events, choir potlucks, board meetings, small group dinners. She learned church songs quickly and smiled at me with a softness that was both practiced and invasive. The board members who once deferred to my opinion now addressed Marcus first, then Tiffany. I watched them rearrange themselves. Marcus justified his behavior as companionship in ministry, as someone to help with paperwork and planning. When I asked where the memorial fund money had gone, he answered with a wave and mentioned unforeseen expenses. The speeches were gentle. The entitlement beneath them was sharper than any sermon I'd heard. Then Marcus did something worse than bring her to the pew. He began to speak of our finances as if they were his alone. He stopped telling me about fundraising deficits and started signing checks without my name. When I asked to see the fellowship hall receipts, he accused me of mistrust and piety policing. The deacons, who had been my allies, stepped back and let his charisma do the convincing. "Pastor's calling is heavy," they would say. "He needs support." Support turned into allowances, allowances into habit. I started staying silent because I was tired of being accused of being petty. One night, I listened to a voicemail someone left for Marcus. Merchandise orders unpaid, a contractor unpaid, a youth trip canceled. The church phone felt like a stranger's limb in my hand. I did the math slowly, like someone reading a will. The totals weren't small. The ledger showed months of missed entries and repeated, "to be handled by Marcus." When I confronted him in the kitchen, Tiffany standing in the doorway as if she had come to hold a casserole, Marcus's arrogance flared. "You always were good with numbers, Ruby. Maybe keep that at the salon," he said with that condescending half-smile. Tiffany's eyes dropped politely to the linoleum. That was the night something in me cracked, but I still didn't shout. I sat at the table and watched my hands fold like prayer. The breaking point came quietly. A mother from the youth group approached me after Sunday service, eyes rimmed with tears, and whispered that the fellowship hall down payment check had bounced when the building contractor tried to deposit it. The contractor was furious. The community was murmuring. Marcus stood at the pulpit, practiced grief in his voice, promising to make it right. I watched him from the back, and for the first time I felt anger, not as fire, but as ice settling in. I walked out before the benediction. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I left with his voice inside my head saying, "Pray about it, Ruby." I thought, no more praying for what someone else refuses to account for. The next morning, I met with Ms. Jenkins, my financial advisor of 20 years, over tea at the small conference table in her office. She had been my mother's advisor, too. Her voice had steadied me through funerals and tax seasons. I slid a folder across the table, bank statements, co-signatures, memos I had kept for decades. "Ruby," she said without surprise, "you have more control here than you know." Her hands were older than mine, and they moved with the kind of certainty I craved. We reviewed the trust documents and the joint accounts. There were clauses Marcus had used loosely, and there were liabilities in his name I had unwittingly covered. Ms. Jenkins spoke about revocation and withdrawal with the matter-of-fact tenderness of someone removing splinters. That afternoon, I went home and opened the old cedar box where my mother kept family papers. Photographs slid out. A younger Marcus and me on our wedding day. My salon when it was just 3 chairs and a cooler of bottled water. The children in Sunday school uniforms with ties crooked like childhood. I turned each photograph over and read the scrawled notes. I had given my inheritance to fund joint things, convinced it would be merged with ministry good. I had signed, co-signed, and cosseted. But those papers also showed that I retained rights to revoke my portion of the trust under specific conditions, one being material dishonesty in using funds for personal enrichment. The condition was written in careful legalese, almost as if someone had known one day it might need to be used. I did not call my husband. I printed the documents, initialed where necessary, and walked to the downtown courthouse to have a clerk time-stamped. The clerk asked if I needed help, and I said, "Yes, I need to make sure this is official." He slid the papers back with a rubber stamp and a polite "God bless." God had been mentioned a great deal in my marriage. Now the rubber stamp felt like a small, secular benediction. On the way home, I stopped by the salon and closed the shop for the afternoon. The chairs faced the window like people waiting for instruction. I locked the door and placed the keys in my bag. That week, I canceled the recurring transfers from my boutique account into the church's building fund. I called the payroll service and updated the person authorized to sign for refunds. I transferred my inheritance into a secure account labeled Ruby Living Trust. Small acts, quiet, legal, done. I made no announcement at church. I didn't post anything on social media. I mailed certified notices to the bank, to the mortgage company, and to the church treasurer, documents that only a stack of envelopes would recognize as life-changing. I felt no gloating as I slid the last notice into the mailbox. I felt only an extraordinary calm, like someone who had set down an oversized tray after carrying it for too long. The decision wasn't born of malice, it was born of clarity. I packed one box from the bedroom with sentimental things, a hymnal with my mother's notes, a photograph of the salon grand opening, a stack of old receipts. I scheduled a consultation with a realtor in Scottsdale after a friend called me one afternoon and said, "Ruby, you have to see the light out here." The idea of Sunday mornings without the weight of other people's crises sounded like a small sin. I booked a flight and left the dates open in my calendar. As I closed the box, Marcus texted, "Where are you?" I didn't reply. I didn't have to. Putting my signature on those revocation papers had already answered him. Before I left Baltimore, I made one other quiet move. I sent copies of our financial records to the church board's email, not with a flourish, but with a subject line that read, "Request for full financial review." I attached the documents I had remembered over the years, receipts, canceled checks, and spreadsheets Marcus had never bothered to reconcile. It wasn't an accusation so much as an invitation to accountability. I left the inbox on red and stepped onto the plane, cradling a hotel mug of sad coffee, feeling like someone who had at last closed a heavy door without slamming it. The first ripple hit harder than I imagined. 2 weeks after the notice, a contractor called the church office, demanding payment for the completed fellowship hall floor. Marcus's check, written for the down payment, was returned for insufficient funds. The contractor stormed the board meeting with a stack of return checks and a voice so loud it made the stained glass windows tremble. Deacon Lewis, who had once nodded at Marcus's explanations, sat white-faced as he read the bank stamp, NSF. A murmur drifted through the congregation like wind over dry grass. Marcus's features, usually smooth with sermon control, twitched. They called an emergency audit. The auditors arrived with clipboards and thin, efficient pens. They found misallocated donations, a youth fund used to pay for a personal trip, and records that showed Marcus had been signing on discretionary expenses without board approval. The surprise twist, one that no one saw coming, was that Tiffany's payroll was listed on the church books as an event consultant, with recurring deposits that lined up with her moving expenses. It wasn't malicious theater. It was a string of small, entitled choices that had stacked into a collapse. People began to whisper about privacy and marital issues, but the auditors only cared about numbers. Marcus stood in front of the congregation the following Sunday with the kind of humility that read like an admission. He promised to cooperate with the board and fix the administrative errors. The deacons voted for an independent investigation. That night, Marcus came home and searched my face for rescue. "Ruby, the board," he started. His voice cracked. For months, I had been the default savior. I had always been the one to repay a bounce check with my savings or to patch over a ministry misstep with a donation. Now the institution he called his pulpit became a magnifying glass on his choices. The deacons found ledgers missing pages and personal charges disguised as ministry expenses. One of them, Deacon Lewis, brought printed copies of receipts he had kept secretly because something had always felt off to him. His hands trembled slightly when he slid them across the table, pages marked with hotel stays and restaurant tabs running up against donation dates. The church's lending bank put a freeze on accounts pending investigation. The fellowship hall purchase stalled mid-transaction. Contractors left with their vans and their notes. Marcus's name began to circulate with qualifiers: under review, questioned, mismanaged. The congregation was in a state of uneasy revelation. Some people defended him, relied on his past sermons as an inoculation. Others admitted they'd noticed small inconsistencies and had been too afraid to speak. The board convened, and after a long, heavy meeting, voted to suspend Marcus temporarily while the investigation concluded. When the notice went up on the church's website, it felt to me like a public curtain falling. I didn't gloat. I watched like someone at an open window as rain began to reveal the outlines of a house not as sturdy as it had seemed. An unexpected twist tightened around our lives. Tiffany was not an innocent bystander. The auditors found that she had been listed as a consultant on several grants, and her bank account had received transfers that lined up with personal purchases. Whether she had known the source of the funds or had been complicit mattered to some. To others, it was proof that entitlement had settled into our home like mold. She removed herself from the choir and stopped returning calls. The first Sunday after the suspension, Marcus stood at the pulpit with a face I did not want to see, and read a statement that had been crafted by frustrated lawyers. He lowered his eyes, and the congregation that had once looked to him for answers now looked for something else: order, honesty, a return to the simple faith they had been promised. I sat in a small airport cafe in Scottsdale when a news alert popped up on my phone, an article about the church investigation, headlined with Marcus's name and the word suspended. People I had known for years started text messages that began, "Did you hear?" Men who had once come to me for advice now asked me through mutual friends if they could help. Marcus reached out asking for a meeting, his voice soft over voicemail. I was not moved. The world he had built, the congregation's trust, the fellowship hall plans, the easy assumptions, crumpled not because I wanted it to, but because I had ceased to prop it up. They came back. Not all at once, but in a steady trickle. Deacon Lewis, once a pillar, came by my salon months later with a bag of biscuits and a look that said he had been carrying something heavy. "We should have asked," he said, and his shame was like rain on the roof. He wanted to know if there was help, if I would come to a town hall to answer questions. I listened, hands covered in conditioner, and when he finished, I folded my fingers around a towel and said, "Bless your heart, Deacon, but I'm done." He left with his head bowed and the weight of words unloaded. Marcus called, then texted, then sent a handwritten letter. He sent pictures of the house being put up for sale, of his face looking older in a small passport photo. He asked for mercy, asked for help with legal fees, asked for one more try. Tiffany reached out once with a message that read like a plea. I didn't realize. She asked if we could meet for coffee. People who had tasted the comforts I provided expected them to still exist. They wanted access to what I had built, the salon's network, the social credibility, the quiet ways I could make reconciliation feel easy. I met one of them, Marcus, once, under the noon sun, at a neutral cafe with plants in mismatched pots. He came with a face that knew regret, but not responsibility. He began to speak in the familiar cadences of apology I had heard for years. I put down my cup of tea, watched a small bird hop among the cobbles, and when his sentences slowed, I said, "Bless your heart, Marcus, but I'm done." He searched my face for the old woman who would patch and mend, but I was not that woman anymore. I did not instruct him on how to repair. I handed him silence and a plane ticket receipt, a small printed thing showing my move to Arizona, my new address, the life I had arranged that did not include him. The finality of it did not feel celebratory. It felt ordinary. I painted the walls of my Scottsdale condo with a color called Desert Hush and planted succulents in shallow clay pots. I woke on a Sunday morning to a sky that looked too big and drank coffee on a small porch while the neighborhood awoke. I found that ordinary tasks, watering plants, calling my sister in Baltimore, opening the salon's mail remotely, were acts of repair. I found a Sunday service at a small community church where the pastor spoke plainly and did not confuse charisma for invincibility. I hummed along to hymns and left before the sermon ended, not because I had somewhere else to be, but because I had learned the joy of leaving. Letters still arrived, requests, apologies, sometimes legal notices. I kept one, a printed note from the board saying they had restructured governance and put safeguards in place. Another was a short message from a young mother I used to mentor, thanking me for the summer program funds that had been saved because I had shifted them into a restricted account before leaving. That, more than any headline, warmed me. Someone else's child could still eat at the table because I had decided to stop feeding those who would not be accountable. The ending comes in quiet gestures. Some mornings I sit on my condo's small porch with a worn hymn book and an unfinished crossword, the kind of slow morning that used to terrify me because there were always people to serve. I sip coffee, fingertips cool around the mug, and watch the sun rise over a range that does not know my history. I do not gloat at Marcus's fall. I do not catalog his mistakes. I water the succulents, small, deliberate motions, with a feeling that is not revenge, but mercy directed toward myself. One afternoon, a neighbor walked by and complimented the geraniums on my balcony. I told her they were my mother's favorite. She smiled and said, "You take care of them well." I nodded and felt the correctness of that small miracle. I had traded a life of constant patching for a life where my hands could be gentler. I kept one ritual from Baltimore. On Sundays, I wore a simple dress and walked to a small church where no one knew my story. I sat 5 rows back and listened. In the hush between hymns, I closed my eyes and let the silence be enough. The last image is a small thing. My hand closing a book I keep on the kitchen counter, a book of family recipes and small prayer requests, then setting it beside a ceramic pot that reads, "Home." Sunlight spilled across the letters. I felt no triumph, only a steady pulse of peace.